Californians have historically placed a high value on higher education. Indeed, California's universities have generally been viewed as among the very best in the world. But as the cost of providing higher education keeps rising, the UC and CSU systems have seen significant cuts in state funding in the last few years. And while the economy and the state's funding for higher education are finally beginning to improve, the governor has made it clear that the UC and CSU systems will have to do more with less. Can higher education costs be cut while at the same time improving access and graduation rates? What are the governor's proposals to improve higher education in California, and will they work? We'll ask. A key spokesperson for the Brown administration, H.D. Palmer, the Deputy Director of External Affairs at the California Department of Finance. Jennifer Kuhn, Deputy Legislative Analyst and an expert on education issues at the non-partisan California Legislative Analysts Office. And Republican Assemblymember Kristin Olsen of Modesto. UCs and CSUs, getting a bigger bang for the buck.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. The headlines about Governor Jerry Brown's newly proposed funding increase have focused on freezing tuition for higher education. Lesser known is the call by the governor for the University of California and California State University systems to rein in costs, operate more efficiently, and get students to obtain their diplomas more quickly. Our guest is a key spokesman for the Brown administration, H.D. Palmer, Deputy Director of External Affairs for the California Department of Finance. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Happy to be back. Thank you for having me.
Well, there's three big issues the governor seems to be focusing on in his higher education budget, and that is improving access, reducing cost, and improving student graduation rates. So let's address each one of those in order.
All of which are interrelated too.
Yeah. Let's talk about the first one. That is improving access. What's the governor proposing?
Well, the governor is proposing a couple of things, one of which is that as part of the overall funding increase for UC and CSU next year, about $125 million, about $10 million would be earmarked to begin to develop online courses that will help to break some of the bottlenecks in some of the lower level courses that are prerequisites to be able to move on. Because if there's a blockage there and students can't get those courses that they need to move on, then that's going to mean that they're going to have to stay in longer, and that's going to mean more cost, more debt for themselves and for their parents. The second thing is to propose a cap on the number of courses, accredited courses that students can take with state support. And the idea is to help move them through the process and be able to free up some space, because access is one of the things that's going to be critical to student achievement and to cost savings.
Yeah, those are the unit caps that he's talking about.
Exactly.
So the super seniors, people that seem to stay in school forever.
Right.
There's actually a cost to the state for those folks. What is exactly the cost of to the state for folks staying in school beyond the 120 units they need to graduate?
It's the state subsidy. What the state is providing is in terms of the overall share of the cost of education for those students. So if they're staying on for a fifth year or a sixth year, it's not only costing them more money, it's costing the state more money. And again, at the expense of students who are through the pipeline and can't get the courses they need to try to graduate on time.
What about controlling the cost of higher education? I mean, they've been escalating pretty quickly as well. What is the governor proposing to control costs? As online education is one of his big proposals, correct?
That and the unit caps are as well, because the system that we've got now, first of all, let us agree that the university system and the college system in California is one of the finest in the nation, if not the world. It was just announced that Berkeley and UCLA have been recognized as two of the top 10 research universities in the entire world. That said, we have a system that's not sustainable right now. We've got revenue growth in the state that's growing at about 4% a year. And their initial proposals, UC was proposing a 12% increase, and CSU was proposing an 18% increase. So what's going to fill that gap? In the past, it's been,
that might have been wishful thinking on their part, too.
Right, but that was their initial proposal. And what fills that gap? It would be tuition increases. And as the governor said in the State of the State address, we can't expect students or their parents to continue to be the default financiers for colleges and universities. So what the governor's committed to do is to say, for the next 2 years, I commit to a 5% year-over-year increase for UC and CSU, a 4% increase each year for the 2 years after that. In return, both systems have got to start developing more efficiencies, such as online courses, such as unit caps, to be able to try to move people to a faster time to graduation, to get them done in the job market and with less cost and less debt.
Well, one of the criticisms, though, is that the governor's giving this money to UC and CSU with, quote, unquote, no strings attached. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, we believe that working with the Board of Regents at UC and the Board of Governors at CSU, they understand that this is a system that's not sustainable. The governor has been to meetings with both of those bodies already. He will continue to be there. And in working with them, we think that we can get to a mutual system whereby we all recognize the kinds of reforms that we need to put in place. But the governor has teed 2 of them up in this budget with the online courses and the unicaps.
You don't want to talk about the online courses. There's a question of whether or not they're going to be as efficient, whether or not they're going to provide the same quality level of education. But one of the things that, another thing that people question is whether or not people will graduate with online classes. There was a study that showed that only about 10% of people who take online classes actually complete them. Is there a concern that this is actually not going to help the graduation rate?
Well, that study, and I'm not familiar with it, may have been referring to what they're called MOOCs, massive open online courses that are being provided free of charge, and people are participating because of their intellectual curiosity. That's not the case with what the governor's proposing. We're talking about online courses that will be part of what you pay for in tuition. The other thing the governor's talking about is having them being asynchronous, which means that everybody doesn't have to go online at the same time. You can take those courses online, when your schedule is convenient. And in terms of interaction with teachers, or lecturers, that can be done online too. We've got remarkable technologies and cell phones and Skype, Google Hangouts, all of those types of things, where there can be a face-to-face interaction with instructors. And again, the goal of this is to utilize technology in a creative way to try to free up more of those blockages that we've seen, those dams that show up where students right now can't get the courses they need to move on and to graduate on time.
Well, I want to thank H.D. Palmer from the Department of Finance for joining us. Up next, the nonpartisan LEO's response to the governor's budget proposal. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Some, like the governor, think California's universities must change significantly in the way they do business in light of growing demands and limited resources. Does the way the UCs and CSUs offer higher education need major retooling? Our guest is Jennifer Kuhn, Deputy Legislative Analyst and an expert on education issues with the nonpartisan California Legislative Analysts Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
Well, are the governor's concerns about higher education justified? For example, he's talking about the high-cost delivery model of higher education, that it's just simply not sustainable to have a professor in front of a classroom. Is he right about that?
We think he is making an important point in that despite advances in technology, the traditional higher education delivery model is still predicated on a faculty member with an advanced degree teaching a relatively small number of students in a physical setting. And these costs, labor and facility costs, are even greater at research universities where faculty workload teaching workload tends to be less and their laboratory space tends to be more expensive. Costs in California tend to be even greater because the UC system is relatively larger than other research university systems across.
I read in your report, I think it was the average cost at the UC was $166,000, and the average cost at peer institutions was about $140,000 to graduate a student. And you attribute that to the higher compensation costs, cost of living, emphasis on science, things of that nature?
A combination of those are probably explaining it. The way that UC does business is likely to look a little bit different. Although faculty workloads at research universities are relatively low across the country, between lab space and faculty compensation and class sizes and emphasis on research, it is driving up UC costs somewhat above other research universities.
Okay, what about the way they fund higher education? They typically fund it on this thing called FTE, full-time equivalent, basically enrollment. Does that encourage or discourage innovation and improvement?
It certainly doesn't encourage it explicitly. So traditionally, the state has had this model where it's based entirely on enrollment. It tries to make an estimate on the margin how much UC and CSU are spending to fund an additional student, and gives them an augmentation to serve a set number of students. And the model isn't predicated on changing how they educate students, using technology differently, ensuring that certain improvements in student outcomes are achieved. It's just been very quantitative. We'll give you $10 million for so many students, serve that number of students.
Not necessarily get them out. It talks about the unavailability of some courses. I mean, everybody knows that if you can't get a course if you're a student, that's going to increase your costs. But here's the question. Does it increase the cost to the taxpayer for a student who can't get in a class and it takes them longer to get through school?
Yes, so it's increasing costs for both the student and the state. If students can't get into high demand courses that they need for graduation, they end up taking courses to sort of bide their time, to still get financial aid. They take more units than they need to graduate. It takes longer for them to graduate.
And those courses that they're taking, those extra courses, are being subsidized by the state, correct?
Yes, there's no limit or cap on the number of units the state will subsidize. So it increases the state's cost. It takes longer for students to enter the workforce. Students are also crowding out space that could be used for other students who need to take.
Well, what about graduation rates at UCs and CSUs? How are they faring? Are they getting students out in a timely manner?
UC's system-wide rates are generally good. So for full-time undergraduate students at UC, about 80% are graduating within 6 years. It's a little bit better than the average of other research institutions, which is about 65%. But UC still would recognize it has some problems at some campuses. For example, the graduation rate at UC Merced is less than 60%, at UC Riverside is less than 70%. For CSU, the graduation rates are more disconcerting. So less than half of full-time students at CSU graduate within 6 years.
Less than half?
Less than half. Now that's a little bit better than comparable institutions across the country, so few institutions are doing particularly well in this case. But CSU itself, we, the administration, there's a general belief that CSU needs to be doing better in this area.
What about tuition levels? They've been going up rapidly. How affordable are UCs and CSUs compared to other public universities around the country?
UC tends to be compared to 4 other public research institutions, and its tuition levels are middle of the pack. CSU is compared to 15 public institutions, and it's the lowest of the 15. And when it comes to affordability, it's not just the tuition level, but it's also financial aid and the degree to which those tuition costs are offset. And California across the country is known for having relatively generous aid packages. More than half of UC and CSU students get grant aid that fully covers their tuition.
So tuition's gone up, but so has the aid.
Right. From 2007 through 2012-13, fees doubled, tuition levels doubled, but financial aid, and I think this is sometimes the forgotten part of the story, also doubled. So that for many of these students, as tuition levels were going up, the size of their Cal Grant was going up dollar for dollar. They were, to a large extent, insulated from the impact of the
But
increases.
the people who are paying are the people who don't qualify, the families that don't qualify for those grants and loans.
Right. So for those who do, for the families, for example, in the $50,000 to $75,000 range who are qualifying for aid, they're largely being insulated. At CSU, if you get up above $75,000, or at UC, if you get up above $110,000, that's when your grant aid starts being reduced. These families were seeing increases of 13, 15, 17%.
Okay, up next, we'll get the non-partisan Legislative Analysts Office take on the governor's recent budget proposals for higher education. Will they make the situation better or worse? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Governor Brown's budget attempts to improve access, reduce cost, and improve student graduation rates at the state's CSU and UC colleges and universities. The question is, will it? Our guest is Jennifer Kuhn, legislative analyst and expert on education issues with the non-partisan Legislative Analysts Office. In your report, you state that, quote, the governor's overall approach is unlikely to improve higher education, unquote. Why do you say that?
The main component of the governor's budget plan are these unallocated base increases for the universities, roughly 5% for a number of years, and they're very loosely linked to student achievement outcomes. Under the governor's approach, because he gives the base increases, the performance expectations are very loosely defined. We're concerned that the state could actually see increases in spending per student without any notable improvements. So we just don't think the linkage is tight enough.
I think it's the no strings attached. Do you want to attach those to performance expectations?
Some expectations, yeah.
Okay. And your report also states that, quote, the university funding model has problems, unquote, by emphasizing access over success. What do you mean by that?
Well, traditionally, the state has focused again just on funding the universities for the students that they serve. And even that model, which wasn't particularly good to begin with, since it just promoted access, it didn't really help the universities focus on helping those students succeed. Over the last few years, even that enrollment-based model has unraveled, with the state giving augmentations and reductions to the universities without any strings attached, without any student expectations. So we've been arguing the legislature should consider funding alternatives that would get the universities to focus both on serving a set number of students as well as on helping them succeed, graduate, complete their programs.
Another thing the report states is, quote, extended tuition freeze would likely have a negative long and near-term consequences. Negative long-term and near-term consequences. Why do you say that?
We looked back over the last 25 years at tuition levels and saw that extended periods of flat fees were almost always followed by very steep increases. And the steep increases come during bad economic times.
So in other words, they freeze tuition or keep tuition low. The state then has financial problems. They then, when the economy is not doing well, they then go to the student or family and say, okay, now we're going to increase your tuition dramatically, just when you're in the midst of an economic downturn?
Exactly.
And that, okay.
That's how it's worked over the last quarter of a century. And then we're also concerned in the near term, if we freeze tuition levels and ask the state to bear every cost increase, then students don't have an incentive to make sure that every cost increase is justified, that is providing value to them in their program, that the state is getting value as well. So both in the long term and the near term, we think there are these adverse consequences of something that might sound good, extended tuition freezes.
Right. Just wait till your next kid goes through school. It's going to probably be a big increase. Okay, what about dealing with sharing the cost of higher education? I think you alluded to something referred to as a unit cap proposal. What do you think about that proposal, the unit cap proposal?
We both think that the state and students should have an expectation about the share of costs that they should cover. But then we're also concerned that right now the state does not limit the number of units that it'll subsidize. So there's very weak incentives for both the student and the institutions to focus on completing programs. So we do think it's reasonable that the state have a limit on the number of units that it'll subsidize. And then the governor and the legislature will just need to work through what kinds of courses to count toward that cap.
It's kind of the devil is in the details, right? What issues need to be addressed if you're going to really implement a successful unit cap policy?
The state has to consider whether it'll count courses that were taken in high school, that were taken through other providers, that were unsubsidized. What will happen if you're doing a double major or if you failed a course? In all of these cases, we think there are solutions such that the state can still create positive incentives for students to save their own time and money, take courses in high school, test out of college courses, still explore majors, without providing such incentives that neither the student nor the institution are really focused on completion.
Your report also states that the governor's proposal regarding higher education include, quote, some good ideas, unquote, but they need, quote unquote, reworking. So what are you referring to there specifically?
I think the best example of this is in online education, where the governor says we need to do something in online education, I'll earmark some money for it, let's have more classes. And the state already has a substantial number of classes. To use community colleges as an example, they already spend $500 million, serve 100,000 full-time equivalent students, have 20,000 courses. So we think the issue is less about more courses and more about how to ensure a student has access to the best online course anywhere in California, maybe anywhere in the country, that they can count it to their degree and that the state's funding it appropriately.
Well, I want to thank Jennifer Kuhn from the LAO for being with us. Up next, we'll get a Republican response to the governor's proposal on higher education. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Our next guest is Republican Assemblymember Kristin Olsen of Modesto, who knows a thing or two about higher education, having served as the Assistant Vice President for Communications and Public Affairs at California State University Stanislaus before joining the state legislature. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, we've seen a lot of large tuition increases at the UC and CSUs over the last few years. Is that a short-term solution, or is that a long-term change and shifting the responsibility for paying for higher education from the state to students and their parents?
I certainly hope it's not a long-term change. I believe it began as a short-term solution to California's heavy budget problems, and rather than prioritize education and higher education, the legislature at that time chose to cut. And so the universities were left pretty much with no choice but to increase tuition. We are to a place now where we have got to get back to the days when state funding of higher education is a priority again. The future of our economy really depends on it.
Yeah, there seems to be a shortfall in the number of college-educated students that we need going forward. But let me ask you this. You and the governor are talking about a tuition freeze. Now, the non-partisan legislative analyst has stated that a tuition freeze would, quote, very likely result in steep tuition increases during the next economic downturn and reduced accountability in the near term, unquote. How do you respond to that?
You know, the goal here is really predictability, and giving students and families a reliable and predictable tuition rate should be the goal. They need to be able to plan for the investment, know what it's going to cost them, and therefore I think it's appropriate to say to a student, if you're going to come to a public university, you can rely on the fact that you're going to have a fixed tuition rate for 4 years. But really the goal is predictability much more than it is a hard and fast freeze.
Okay. Another thing that's being talked about is this thing called a unit cap approach. And they're also talking about moderate, gradual, predictable, as you're saying, tuition increases over time. What are your thoughts about that unit cap proposal? And maybe if there is an increase, it's moderate and it's predictable.
I think a unit cap approach actually makes a lot of sense. It's not okay for students to have, dozens and dozens more units than they need to be able to graduate, because what that leads to is other students who are trying to access a quality education and who simply can't get in.
So the professional student is eating up resources.
It really is. We have limited resources and we need to get students into the system, give them a top quality, fantastic experience, and then get them out and into the workforce so that we can graduate more students.
I think a lot of parents would probably agree with you on that.
I agree.
Let me ask you about this. The governor is talking about providing more flexibility and local control to campuses. The LAO, on the other hand, is saying that, listen, any additional money should be used to pay down debt, take care of employee pension obligations, and if there's anything left over, that should be linked explicitly to performance expectations. So which side do you fall on, the governors or the LAOs?
I actually agree with both statements. There needs to be a balance. The fact is we've got to deal with the debt. That's just wise fiscal management practices. On the other hand, I do believe in the power of local control, allowing university campuses to emphasize where they're strong. But I also think we could benefit from more cooperation between the campuses. Not every degree program needs to be offered at every 23 campus of the CSU system.
It seems like a lot of duplication
of a lot of duplication. So I think the sweet spot is in finding the balance.
What about the LAO's comment that he thinks that online education can be expanded with existing resources? The governor wants to provide, say, $10 million to each of the UC and the CSU. LAO says, no, you can do it with existing resources. What are your thoughts on that?
Certainly there are some things that the universities could do with existing resources. There are examples of some great online programs already taking place. There's no doubt, though, we need to expand that. We need to provide options to students, and the fact is online course offerings are the best option for many, many students in California. I do think it will take existing resources over time, increased funding over time, but we can start with existing resources, and then as universities prove that they're meeting certain benchmarks, increase those funding levels as time goes on.
One of the things you mentioned was this fact that we're going to have a need for more college-educated folks, and PPIC came out with a study that said that the way we're going to be about 1 million graduates short by 2025. The problem people point out is that the populations that are increasing in California are those very populations that aren't going to college or aren't graduating from college. So how do you fix that problem?
This is a great concern in California, and it's one of the reasons we need a predictable and reliable tuition rate so that people can access a quality education and we can encourage more students to attain a college degree. The fact is, right now, we have hundreds of thousands of Californians who can't find a job. And yet, interestingly enough, we have California companies who have job openings and can't find people to fill them. So there's a tremendous gap, particularly in engineering fields, math fields, and we need to make sure we're investing in universities and encourage students to attain the education that they need in order to fill those jobs.
Well, I want to thank Kristin Olsen, Assemblymember from Modesto, for joining us, as well as H.D. Palmer from the California Department of Finance and Jennifer Kuhn from the California Legislative Analyst Office. If you'd like to stay current with state and local politics, you can subscribe to our free and award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.
And now, another perspective.
Governor Brown's budget proposal for higher education certainly provides predictability and stability for the future. However, we need to recognize that there's tremendous demand for higher education in this state, and the budget doesn't provide a significant amount of additional funding for new student enrollment. In addition, there are many, including the governor, who believes that fees should be frozen for a period of time. While I certainly support that, it's important to recognize that the state must make a commitment to fund higher education if in fact we're going to hold fees constant in the coming years. Certainly the future and the outlook is brighter, but we need to be very diligent in looking at making sure that we have the ability to serve students in the future.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.